In 1892, Walter James Hoffman, a physician by training, an ethnologist by employment, was working at Kashina, Wisconsin, at the agency of the Menominee Reservation, with a field notebook and instructions from the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington. The Bureau existed for one purpose, and it stated that purpose without embarrassment: write it down before it is gone. Languages, ceremonies, genealogies, the marks on birch bark, all of it was held to be going, and Hoffman had been sent to take testimony from a people his superiors believed had a few decades left. The work was painstaking. He collected clan names, drew plans of the ceremonial lodge, copied pictographs off birch scrolls, and wrote names down syllable by syllable. What came out of that trip went into the Bureau's 14th annual report, a fat government volume with maps and tables and folded plates, and it is still on the shelf in any decent library. Meanwhile, outside the agency window, this was happening. Northern Wisconsin was being cut. Not selectively, not in parcels clean from lake to lake, white pine for boards and railroad ties, driven down the rivers to mills of a size that existed nowhere else. 21 years earlier, 2 days' travel from where he sat, fire that came up out of the logging slash burned the town of Peshtigo and the people in it in a single night, and it remains the deadliest forest fire in the history of the country, and almost nobody remembers it, because Chicago burned the same night. By the 90s, what was left of the old forest in that part of the state was stumps across millions of acres with scorched ground between them. And in that setting, Hoffman asked his informants a question he considered simple and technical. How long have you been here, and how long has this forest stood? The answer he wrote down contained no number. There was no arrival date in it, and no account of migrating from anywhere else, and almost every people of the Great Lakes has such an account, and an ethnologist expects one. He was told that they were from here, and that the forest was the same forest. Hoffman recorded it the way his discipline required, a tradition, unsupported by external evidence, given as related by the informants. That is how it sits in the report, in the section on origin set in small type. In 1892 there was nothing to check it against. There is today, and it does not get checked against legend. It gets checked against bookkeeping, one number, which I will give you in Block 7. For now, hold only what Hoffman could see out of the window. In every direction around that reservation, the forest was already gone. You have to understand the scale of what was happening outside, because the entire story sits inside it. In the second half of the 19th century, the white pine forest of the Great Lakes was the largest concentration of merchantable softwood on the continent, and it was liquidated in roughly 50 years. Wisconsin was the leading lumber state in the country in the 1890s. The method was total. Crews went in over the winter, felled everything of size, skidded the logs on ice roads to the riverbank and piled them there, and when the ice went out in spring, the drive carried the whole winter's cut downstream to the mills. Every company stamped its own mark into the ends of its logs, registered like a cattle brand, so that a mixed drive of 500,000 logs could be sorted out at the boom below. What was left behind was not a thinned forest, it was ground covered in tops, branches and stumps, slash, drying through every summer that followed. That is what burned at Peshtigo on the 8th of October 1871, and killed somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people in a few hours. And it is the reason nobody can give you a firm figure. Entire settlements were removed, along with the records of who had been living in them. When the pine ran out, the industry did not restore anything. It sold the land. The region became known as the Cutover, millions of acres of stumps marketed to immigrant farmers as agricultural opportunity on soil that was never going to carry a farm. And a generation later, much of it came back to the counties as tax-delinquent property nobody wanted. This was not a crime committed by unusual men. It was the ordinary economics of an extractive boom, running exactly as designed, and by the time Hoffman was writing in his notebook, it had already run through nearly everything within reach of a river. Subscribe now, because there was one block of ground inside that region where it did not happen. And the reason it did not happen is the whole point of this video. Put yourself in Hoffman's chair for a moment, because his reaction was professional rather than dismissive, and understanding it explains the next 100 years. An ethnologist in 1892, arriving among an Algonquian people of the Great Lakes, expected a migration account, because he had collected them before, and his colleagues had collected them everywhere. The Ojibwe tradition is the famous one, a long movement westward from the eastern sea, guided by a shell that rose out of the water, halting at a series of named places, and it maps onto real geography so well that it has been used to organize archaeological work in the region. Migration accounts are the norm. They are what a people tells you when you ask where they came from, and they are useful precisely because they contain sequence. So when Hoffman asked, and the answer had no journey in it, no earlier homeland, no interval of wandering, when the answer was that this ground was the origin, that the people had come into being at the mouth of the river that carries their name, and that the forest standing there was continuous with the forest that had always stood there, he had nothing to file it under, except tradition. He wrote it accurately. He did not mock it, and he did not embellish it. He put it where the standards of his profession said it went, in the origin section, presented as the statement of his informants, unverified. And that was the correct thing to do in 1892, and it is also the exact mechanism by which a claim gets frozen. Once a statement is printed as unverified tradition, the next scholar cites it as unverified tradition, and the one after that, and nobody goes and checks it, because checking it was never anyone's assignment. The claim did not fail. It was never tested. And the reason it was never tested is that in 1892 nobody had the instrument. The instrument is not a shovel or a carbon date. It is a boundary line, and it had been drawn 38 years earlier under conditions worth describing exactly. The Menominee homeland was not a reservation. Before the treaty era, it ran to something on the order of 10 million acres across what is now Wisconsin and part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It came apart in pieces, the way these things did, through a sequence of cessions in the 1830s and 40s, in which land went out and the territory contracted inward toward the Wolf River. Each cession was negotiated, signed, and legal, and each one was smaller than the last. Then came the part that matters. In 1848, the terms called for the Menominee to leave Wisconsin entirely and remove west of the Mississippi to land in Minnesota, and the leadership did what the agreement provided for. They went and looked at it. Chief Oshkosh travelled to the country on the Crow Wing River, inspected what was being offered, and came back with an answer that was not a negotiating position. It was a refusal. He would not take his people there. What followed was several years of a nation declining to move, while the machinery for moving it stood ready. And it ended in 1854 in a treaty signed on the Wolf River, under which the Menominee gave up the claim to the Minnesota land, and were confirmed instead on a block of their own country here, a little over 250,000 acres, reduced again 2 years later when a strip was cut away for the Stockbridge and Muncie, and sitting today at roughly 235,000. 10 million acres to 235,000. That is a loss of about 98%, and there is no version of this in which it reads as a good outcome. But hold what the remaining 2% actually is. It is not a random allotment of whatever was left over. It is the specific ground they refused to leave, chosen and held by people who had been told to go somewhere else, and said no. And within 20 years everything outside that line was going to be cut flat, which means that line was about to become something nobody drew it to be. Here is a thing about the 19th century that people underestimate. A tribe holding a forest under federal trust could not simply decide to harvest and sell its own timber. It needed an act of Congress. So in 1890, Congress passed one, sponsored by a Wisconsin representative named Robert La Follette, authorizing the Menominee to cut and market 20 million board feet a year, and the terms written into that authorization were not the terms the industry outside was operating under. Dead and downed timber first, selection rather than clearing, a cut size to what the forest could carry indefinitely rather than to what the market would absorb this season. In 1908, a second La Follette Act extended it, wrote sustained yield into the statute itself, and provided for the tribe's own mill. It was built at Neopit. It began cutting that year, and it is still the centre of the operation, a working sawmill that has been running on the same forest for over a century, which is not a sentence you can write about any other mill in the region, because the forests those mills stood on are gone, and so are the mills. Now, I am not going to tell you this ran cleanly, because it did not, and the failures came from the same direction every time. The forest was under federal supervision. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ran the supervision, and the Bureau made a long series of decisions the tribe opposed, including cutting practices that violated the selective principle outright. The Menominee did not accept it. They pursued the United States through the courts for mismanagement of their own forest, over decades, and in 1951 they won a judgment against the federal government in the Court of Claims, worth something on the order of $8.5 million. Read that sentence again. A tribe sued the government that was supposedly managing its property for managing it badly, and proved it, which tells you where the expertise actually sat, and it tells you why what happened 3 years later was so nearly fatal. In 1954, Congress passed the Menominee Termination Act. It did not come out of nowhere. The year before, Congress had adopted a resolution setting out termination as national policy, and it was applied to tribes across the country. The stated logic in this case was that a nation doing well enough to run a profitable mill no longer needed a federal trust relationship, which meant, in practice, that competence was treated as grounds for withdrawal. Termination took effect in 1961. The reservation stopped being a reservation and became a county, the newest, and by a wide margin, the poorest in Wisconsin. Federal services ended. The tribal enterprise was reorganized as a corporation with shares, and the land, for the first time in its history, became taxable. Understand what that does to a forest. A forest is a slow asset. It pays out over decades, and it demands patience, and patience is precisely what a tax bill does not permit. Within a few years, the county was selling lakeshore land to outside buyers to raise revenue. The hospital closed, the tuberculosis sanatorium closed, and the arithmetic that had held for a century began to break. What stopped it was not Washington reconsidering. It was an organized campaign by Menominee people themselves, a movement called Drums, with Ada Deer among its leaders, which fought the land sales, marched, lobbied, and pushed a restoration bill through Congress against the entire momentum of federal policy. It was signed on the 22nd of December 1973, and the reservation came back. 12 years is not long enough to grow a tree in that forest. It was long enough to nearly end it. Termination lasted 12 years, and it is the closest that forest has ever come to being liquidated, and it came not from a logging company, but from an act of Congress. And through all of it, one thing kept running, and it had been running since before the treaty, and it has never once stopped. The ledger. Since 1854, when that boundary was confirmed, the Menominee have harvested more than 2 billion board feet of timber off that land. 2 billion. That is not a token cut, and it is not a museum forest that nobody touches. It is a working industrial operation that has been shipping lumber continuously for well over a century and employing people to do it. Now here is the second half, and this is the number I have been holding since Block 1. The volume they have taken off that ground is roughly twice the volume of timber standing on it, and there is more standing timber there today than when they started counting. More. Not the same. More. Read that as an accounting statement, because that is what it is. They have removed double the inventory, and the inventory has gone up. There is no trick in it, and no accounting sleight of hand. It is what selective cutting on a long rotation does, when it is done properly for 170 years without interruption. You take the growth and leave the stock. A forest managed that way is not a mine being emptied, it is a fund being drawn on at less than its yield, and a fund drawn on at less than its yield gets larger while you are spending it. Every forestry school in the world teaches this. Almost nowhere on earth has anyone actually done it for 7 generations and kept the receipts. And now go back to a room in Kashina in 1892, and the sentence Hoffman filed as unverified tradition. He was told the forest standing there was continuous with the forest that had always stood there. He had no way to check it, and he said so honestly. But the thing that makes that statement checkable was never going to be a date. It was going to be a practice, whether a people who say a forest is continuous behave, over the long run, like people who mean it. That is now one of the best documented things about them, and the proof is not in an archive, it is visible from orbit. Pull up a satellite image of northeastern Wisconsin, and you will find a rectangle. Not a soft edge, not a gradient, a hard-cornered block of dense, unbroken canopy, sitting inside a landscape of cleared fields, roads, second growth and fragmentation, with the difference so sharp that the treaty boundary of 1854 is legible from space without any labels on the image. It is one of the most frequently reproduced illustrations in forestry teaching, and what it shows is not a park and not a wilderness preserve. It is the working forest of a nation that has been logging it hard the entire time. Roughly 220,000 of those acres are forested, carrying dozens of tree species across a full spread of ages, managed on rotations measured in generations rather than quarters. Stands are marked tree by tree. The instruction has been the same since the 1890s, and it is usually given in one line. Take the mature, take the sick, leave the rest standing. The operation was among the very first in the United States to be independently certified as sustainable when third-party certification arrived in 1993, and it collected a presidential award for sustainable development 2 years after that, which is a slightly comic sequence of events if you think about it, an international body arriving after 140 years to confirm that the practice met the standard. And the reason that image matters more than any argument in this video is that it is a controlled experiment nobody designed. Same latitude, same soils, same climate, same trees, same markets, same century. One boundary line. Inside it, one set of decisions. Outside it, another. The result has been running for 170 years, and you can see the outcome from orbit with your own eyes. Which brings us back to what Hoffman actually wrote down. and to the one thing about all of this that I still cannot prove. So let me be straight, because this is where I stop narrating. I cannot hand you a date. Nothing in this video demonstrates that the Menominee have been on that ground for 10,000 years, and if somebody tells you a satellite photograph proves an origin account, they are selling you something. Oral tradition is testimony, not measurement, and Hoffman was right to log it as testimony. But look carefully at what actually got treated as the weak part. The claim was never only about antiquity. It was about continuity, that the forest and the people were one continuous thing, rather than two things that happened to end up in the same place. That is a claim about conduct, it is testable, and it has now been tested harder than almost any land management claim on this continent, through the liquidation of every forest around it, through federal supervision that had to be fought in court, through 12 years of termination that came close to ending it, and through 2 billion board feet of timber going out the gate on trucks and rail cars. The forest is still there, and it is bigger than it was. Hoffman's study is called The Menominee Indians. It fills the first part of the 14th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. It went to press in 1896, and it is a public document that has been digitized and is free to read. You can open it tonight and find that passage in the small type where he left it, exactly as he set it down, marked unconfirmed. He did his job, and he did it well. He wrote down what he was told, accurately, without ornament, and marked it unconfirmed because it was unconfirmed, and then went home to a country busy proving that his informants were the ones who knew what they were doing. The verification took 170 years, and it was never going to come from an archive. It came from the fact that they kept the forest, and everyone else did not.